Chapter 19, Sounds of the Past. June arrived. The days were warmer and longer. Sometimes in the early evening I would go and sit in a grassy yard behind the school hospital. It had once been a play area. Swings hung motionless, unused. A sandbox sprouted weeds. Big wooden barrels had long ago been joined together to make a network of tunnels for kids to crawl through. Often I found myself wondering what the yard had been like before the war, with children laughing, yelling, and running around. It was not a great deal unlike the play area in the primary school I had attended as a little boy back in Vilsburg. Tamara joined me there one afternoon. At first our conversation was about the patients and ordinary matters we dealt with every day. But then she asked me about myself, and if I remembered anything more. I told her as much as I could about my family and other things I could safely share with her without giving myself away. Then I asked her about herself. "Well, I went to this school." "You did?" I said, surprised. "Yes, when it was a school and not a place the war turned it into." I followed her as she made her way across the yard. "My father built this," she said, putting a hand on one of the interconnecting barrels of the labyrinth. "He made it for the school. Dungeon World, that's what we called it. It was just about everybody's favorite thing. Lena, Marussia, Vlad, Katerina, all of us. We'd crawl around in there for hours." She smiled at the memory. The smile sagged as she ran slender fingers over the warped wood of one of the barrels. "Have you lived in Alereni all your life?" I asked. "Most of it. My parents moved here from Moscow when I was a baby." She grimaced. "Papa was in prison when I was born." "In prison? For what?" "For being an anti-communist, an enemy of the state." A hard smile turned into a sneer. "He thought the communists were idiots and told them so. He had the guts to stand up to them." "Like you did during the inspection when you helped the paralyzed man?" Tamara shrugged delicate shoulders. "That was very brave," I said. "Thank you." She sat down on a school bench, suddenly looking very young and vulnerable. "How old are you?" I asked. 15. She looked around the schoolyard. "Do you ever wish you were just a little kid again?" "Yes, or at least have things back the way they were. Until I was 12 years old or so, everything was so great." "What happened when you were 12? "Well, that's how old I was when the lousy Germans invaded us, and right before that Papa got in trouble with the communists again. He wrote a pamphlet about Stalin betraying any of the good in communism. He wrote under a false name, but they caught him anyway. He was imprisoned again, this time for life, at the Peter and Paul fortress in Leningrad." I waited for her to go on. "And while he was in prison, Mother started seeing another man. We fought. More and more I stayed with Katerina at Zoya's house. One day when I went home, Mother wasn't there. She'd run off with the other man." Tamara scowled. "I don't know where she is, or really care." "Have you been staying with Zoya ever since?" She nodded. I sat down on the bench, feeling too big and awkward for the thing. "Your father's still in prison?" Anger flaring in her eyes, Tamara put a hand to her long hair and flipped it to one side. "No, he's dead." I hung my head and then looked up, frowning, waiting for her to continue. "He was killed at Leningrad in 1941. "I'm sorry." "It's not your fault. You didn't do anything." I averted my gaze from hers. "He was taken straight from prison and put in a death squad." "What's that?" I asked with genuine ignorance. "The worst kept secret in Russia," replied Tamara. "Death squads were sent in ahead of the regular troops, armed only with grenades. They ran straight at the stinking, bloody Germans. They stepped on mines. They made the Germans use up ammunition. Those who get close enough threw their grenades. If they turned and ran, they were shot by their own troops." Her eyes hardened with rage. "And that's what they did to my father." "I'm so sorry, Tamara." I put a hand on her shoulder. "I hate the communists just as much as I hate the Nazis," she said, her voice a lingering whisper. "I do too," I said. In the old house where I lived, there was an antique radio and a record player. The thing, which ran on a gasoline-powered generator, was huge, about the size of a refrigerator and about as heavy. None of us at the house could get it to work, but Reuben, after tinkering with it for a few hours one day, had both the radio and record player going. That afternoon we hauled the contraption and a box of records to the hospital in an ambulance. Not long after we had set it up in one of the wards, and Vlad and Oleg had mounted speakers in all the wards, nothing was coming out through the radio. But then we had tried out a record. It was incredible. No one had heard music in so long. All of a sudden, the whole hospital was filled with it. It was classical music, Tchaikovsky. Time had stopped. For a moment there was peace. For a moment there was beauty. Everyone was mesmerized. There were smiles on the faces of most of the patients and staff, and there were tears, too. Sergo came in from outside. With his scarred, dented-in head, he stood in place, swaying from side to side, holding his rifle as though it was his dancing partner. It was the happiest I had ever seen the people in the hospital. From then on, every day, about from 1:30 to 3:50 p.m., there was a symphony. At 4 o'clock, there was usually a broadcast from Radio Moscow. The broadcast, though biased and filled with propaganda, gave me some idea as to how the war was going. On June 6th, the Allies had landed in France at the beaches of Normandy. And while the British, Canadians, and Americans were coming from the west, the Russians were attacking from the east. Towns and cities all over Germany were being bombed to pieces, and I was sick with worry about my family. When I try, I can still hear the broadcaster's voice, an irritating growl of bombast and political garbage. Yesterday, the glorious forces of the Soviet Union struck yet another mighty blow into the heart of the fascist murderers, driving relentlessly westward as our fearless soldiers. One afternoon, during one of those broadcasts, the mail arrived. I was giving a sponge bath to a man whose arms looked as though only stitches were holding them together. I continued to work as many of the staff hurried over to see what had come, for themselves and for the patients. As I was finishing up with the sponge bath, I saw Tamara emerge from the group around the mailbag with a letter in hand. Reading it, she made her way across the ward, the place filled with the sound of the broadcaster's voice. She suddenly stopped. A look of horror on her face. She hurried out a door. I made my way outside. I found her across the roadway, sitting on the porch of the abandoned house with a cockeyed green door. Her head was back and her cheeks were wet with tears. "Tamara?" I approached her tentatively. She looked at me, then slowly removed the scarf from around her neck and wiped her eyes with it. "Tamara." The letter fluttered to the ground. She spread the blue scarf wide in her hands and seemed to be studying it. "This is all I have left of him," she said. "Only 5 weeks ago, in this very street, Isaac gave it to me before he left for the front." I looked out at the empty street, in my mind seeing her sweetheart, the tall, handsome young man, then seeing them embrace. I'd been so jealous then, but now I found myself wishing him back, if only to take away Tamara's pain. 5 short weeks, and now he's gone. Dead! A sharp cry suddenly escaped her. She turned away, sobbing. I just stood there, not knowing what to say or do. I waited until her crying finally stopped. She looked up, she reached out to me, and I helped her to her feet. "I'm so sorry about your friend," I managed to say. She cocked her head to one side. "Friend?" "Boyfriend," I corrected myself. "No, Isaac wasn't my boyfriend," she said. "Oh," I muttered, far more surprised and confused than I think I sounded. "Then who was he?" Her arms went around me, weeping. She pressed her head against my chest. He was my brother." "I'm so sorry," I said over and over, feeling 1,000 different things at the same time, holding her and gently stroking her hair. "I'm so sorry, Tamara." From the hospital's came the broadcaster's voice. "And today from the front, yet another victory for Mother Russia."